This movie podcast is presented to you by Untold Stories. This is Season 1, Episode 1. It was around 1:30 p.m. in California, on what was likely the hottest afternoon of August. John Hardley had just returned from what was meant to be his final mission. A clean job, they assured him, with no loose ends. As he stepped out of the Uber a few blocks from his apartment, he felt the warm breeze and the sun's rays on his light-skinned, hairy arms. Walking down the quiet Loma Vista Street in El Segundo, John immersed himself in his Afrobeat playlist, enjoying the latest hits from Burna Boy and Rema. 6 blocks from his building, the weight of his past still hung heavy on his shoulders. He was a man who had seen too much and done too much. But today, it wasn't his past that would haunt him. It was something far more immediate. As John approaches his apartment, a distant scream cuts through the music in his earbuds. He stops, the playlist fading into silence as he turns the volume down. A scream pierced the air, sharp, desperate, unmistakable. The kind of scream that cuts through the everyday noise and demands your attention. John removes his earbuds, straining to locate the source of the scream. His heart begins to race as he moves cautiously toward the sound. John knew danger when he heard it, and this was danger in its purest form. Suddenly, a man in a black jacket bursts out from a nearby building, sprinting in John's direction. Their eyes meet for a split second, just enough time for John to notice the bloodstain on the man's white shirt, partially concealed by his jacket. The man's eyes were wide with panic, his clothes disheveled. John had seen that look before, the look of someone fleeing the scene of a crime. But what crime? John watches as the man disappears down the street, his mind racing. He turns his attention to the building the man had just fled from, a sense of dread washing over him. John knew he should walk away and mind his own business. But something inside him, a lingering trace of conscience, perhaps, compelled him to investigate. The door was slightly open, a pool of blood seeping out through the door. John pushed it open, his instincts screaming at him to be cautious. Inside, the scene is gruesome. A young woman in her late 20s lies in a pool of blood, her body motionless on the floor. A bloody trail leads from the kitchen to where she now rests. The sight inside was one of horror. A young woman, her life violently taken, lay in a pool of her blood. John had seen death before, but this was something else. As John kneels beside the woman, trying to make sense of the scene, he hears the faint creak of a floorboard behind him. He turns sharply, ready for anything. But he wasn't alone. A soft creak of the floorboards betrayed the presence of someone else. From a nearby room, a small boy, no older than 6, emerges. His eyes were wide, filled with a terror no child should ever have to experience. His mother lay before him, lifeless. John approaches the boy cautiously, his voice soft but urgent. John knew he had only moments before the police arrived. He had to act fast. He leaned in close to the boy and whispered to the boy. He told the boy to stay quiet, to tell no one that he had been there. And then he made a promise to find the people responsible for this atrocity. The sound of police sirens grows louder, filling the air with an ominous sense of urgency. The sirens were getting closer. John knew his time was running out. He had to leave, but as he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. John exits the building from the back door of the house, slipping into the street just as the first police car rounds the corner. The police arrived within minutes, their professionalism masking the horror of what they were about to face. They moved quickly, securing the area and establishing a perimeter around the crime scene. The house was barricaded, the yellow crime scene tape fluttering in the breeze. The boy, now sitting on the pavement, looked lost in a world that had suddenly become too big, too dangerous. He was alone, surrounded by strangers in uniforms, cameras flashing as they documented the scene that would haunt him forever. As the police continued their work, an emergency ambulance arrived, paramedics moving swiftly, but their urgency was tempered by the gravity of the scene. This was no ordinary crime. And then, almost as if on cue, another vehicle appeared. A Tesla Cybertruck, its metallic sheen reflecting the flashing lights. Bold letters on its side read FBI. The stakes had just been raised. The focus shifted to the Cybertruck as the door opened. A young woman in her early 30s steps out, her presence immediately commanding attention. She is fair-skinned, with long dark hair cascading over her shoulders. She wears a tight pair of jeans that accentuate her figure, and a pair of dark shades with gold-colored temples covering her eyes, exuding confidence and authority. She was an FBI agent, and the way she carried herself left no doubt. Her dark shades hid her eyes, but nothing could hide the sharpness of her gaze. She was here to take charge. She approached with the kind of calm that only comes from experience, her presence instantly altering the atmosphere. The officers acknowledged her with a nod. They knew who was in charge now. This was no longer just a crime scene. This was now a federal investigation. She didn't need to say much. Her presence alone was enough to reassure the boy, if only a little. She knelt beside him, her voice soft but firm. She was here to find answers, and she would start with the one person who had seen it all. Her eyes, now visible, were sharp, missing nothing as they scanned the boy's face for signs of what he had seen, what he had endured. She spoke softly, yet with a firmness that suggested she would get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. The boy's voice was a whisper, but she heard every word. The details were scarce, fragmented by trauma, but they were enough. Enough to confirm that this was no ordinary murder, and enough to start a chase that would lead down dark and dangerous paths. She stood, her resolve hardening. This was only the beginning, she knew it, and so did the officers who looked to her for direction. The game had changed, and the stakes were higher than anyone could have anticipated. As she moved towards the house, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. But even as the picture became clearer, one thing was certain: this story was far from over. John hardly thought he had left this life behind. But with each step he took away from that house, he knew the truth. He was being pulled back into a world he had tried to escape. A world of secrets, lies, and deadly consequences. The FBI agent stands in front of the house, her eyes narrowing as she surveys the scene, the weight of the investigation already heavy on her shoulders. The boy, now in the care of a police officer, watches her with a mix of fear and hope. And as the night fell over Los Angeles, one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. The truth was out there, buried deep, and John hardly wasn't the only one who would stop at nothing to uncover it. Next Friday on episode 2, on the same channel. Subscribe to listen to every episode.